Welcome to our study of the book of Exodus. The theme is redemption. A.J. Gordon was one of the founders of Gordon Conwell Seminary. He also pastored a church in Boston. And he met a young boy in the front of his church who had a cage and several birds in it. And Gordon asked the little boy, "Where'd you get those birds?" And the boy replied, "I trapped them in the field." And Gordon asked him, what are you going to do with them? He said, "Well, I'm going to play with them, then I'm going to feed them to my old cat." And Gordon asked the young boy, "Well, can I buy them off of you?" And the little boy said, "You don't want to buy these. That would be a bad bargain." But Gordon said, "I'll give you $20 for the cage and the birds." And the boy willingly gave him the bird and the cage, gladly. Gordon went behind his church and opened the gate, the little door to that old coop, and set those birds free. And they flew off into the sky. Well, the next Sunday morning, he took that cage into the pulpit to preach on a sermon that Jesus Christ came to seek and to save those who were lost. And he told the story about this little boy. And he said, the little boy said, "These birds cannot even sing." But then Gordon said, when I opened the door and set them free, it seemed like they were singing redemption, redemption, redemption. And he went on to preach on redemption, which means to set free by paying a price. And we see that in a lot of verses. This theme is throughout the Old Testament. You have redemption in the Old Testament. So it's all through the Old Testament. God redeemed us when he paid the price for our deliverance from sin. 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20. But there's some important Greek words. Kopher in the Old Testament is a big Hebrew word for redemption, to satisfy and to set free. But look at these New Testament words. We are redeemed from the slavery of sin, exorzo. Christ purchased us out of the slave market of sin, Galatians 3:13, from the curse, the curse of law in chapter 4, verse 5, the law itself. Secondly, another aspect of redemption, we are redeemed by the blood of Christ. There is a price to be paid for redemption, agorasa. Christ purchased us in the slave market of sin with his own blood. This is the song that we will sing in heaven, Revelation 5:9. And they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the book and to set the seals thereof. For you were slain, and you have redeemed us." There's our word, redeemed. "You have redeemed us by your blood out of every kindred." So there's a setting free because a price has been paid, but then we are redeemed to a life of freedom to serve. And that's the emphasis in this other word for redemption, lutruo. And Titus, for example, Titus chapter 2, verse 14, uses the word redeemed, and then he ends up by saying zealous of good works. You see that? We're redeemed out of the slave market of sin by a price that has been paid, but then set free to serve our master. That really captures the essence of the book of Exodus. You have the big theme of redemption, but look how that theme is developed. It's developed along those lines. God redeems from slavery, Israel from slavery, chapters 1 to 12. You have the need of redemption in Exodus 1 to 4. You have God punishing the oppressors, that would be Egypt, so they could be delivered from slavery. And then God redeems to salvation. By what? Blood. Blood of the Passover lamb and the power of God seen in the crossing of the Red Sea. But then they were redeemed to serve in Exodus 19-40. You have the word that was given at Mount Sinai. Then you have the instructions for the tabernacle, which make up more than a third of the book. In other words, they were redeemed out of slavery by the price of shed blood to worship and serve. Many Bible scholars believe this is like a little summary of the whole book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 6, you have God sent Moses to Pharaoh to demand that he let his people go, but then Pharaoh increased the labor. And so Moses is complaining to God about that. But look what God says to him. God is going to redeem Israel from slavery. Chapter 6, verse 6. Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt. There's that redemption from slavery. And then to salvation, he uses the word redeem in also verse 6, which we know in Exodus 12 will be the blood, by the blood of the Passover lamb. And then he says he's redeeming them to service, verse 8, and I will bring you in unto the land. I'm not just going to deliver you out of Egypt by the blood of the Passover lamb. I'm going to deliver you into that promised land. So there's that connection to all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, where God promised Abraham he would have that land. So you see this threefold aspect of redemption. Exodus is connected to Genesis with the first word in Exodus 1:1. You see that? There's a conjunction. The first word in Exodus is a conjunction. And so the book of Genesis ends Israel in Egypt, and he has blessed them to these with many, many blessings. And Exodus 1:1-6 reminds us of how Genesis ends. Exodus 1:1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came out of Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. And all the souls, verse 5, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70, for Joseph was an Egyptian, or was in Egypt already. So in Egypt, God blesses Joseph and his family. And then we see another conjunction in verse 7. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. God has blessed them. That's the theme of Genesis. And increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceedingly mighty. And the land, there's that big word from Genesis, and the land was filled with them. This is not the promised land, but again you have this emphasis on land. 400 years later, the Jews are in slavery, but we know in Exodus 12:37, men over 20 numbered 600,000. You had women and children. That's 2 or 3 million now in Egypt. So you have the need for redemption in Exodus 1. So this reminds me so much of what happened in the 20th century to the Jews with Nazism. This is the famous gate of death to the death camp Auschwitz in Poland. You see the railroad tracks leading into it. 1 million Jews were murdered there. Here they are unboarding those trains. The railroad car had no steps, so here you see older Jews being assisted in disembarking. And then you see that German doctor on the left. Well, they would line up in front of these German doctors. He would point one way, they'd go to the labor camp. He would point another way. That's where the majority of them went, was to the death camps and to their death, the gas chambers. So in Exodus 1, you have this need of redemption where Pharaoh takes 4 steps to persecute the Jews. He appointed taskmasters in verse 8 because he saw the great population swell to 2 or 3 million. To him, they were a threat. If an enemy attacked, they could join the enemy. And so he appointed taskmasters, just like those concentration camps had the taskmasters, those German soldiers who would beat the Jews, sometimes to death just for talking instead of working. And then Pharaoh increased the workload in verse 12 to help weaken them. And so now they were afflicted, verse 12 says. And the scriptures, Genesis 15:13, acknowledges that they would be afflicted. God predicted that because of their rebellion against God for 400 years. And the Jews in the 20th century had their workload increased. They would work 16, 18 hours a day. They would be fed soup made from rotten vegetables. Most of them died from disease in those death camps. And then Pharaoh commanded the midwives to kill the male babies, verse 15. So all that additional work and cruelty did not weaken them, did not curtail their numbers. So this is when Pharaoh will have the midwives, command the midwives to murder all the male babies. And of course you have the murder of children and the elderly in those death camps, mostly children and elderly because they couldn't work, were automatically sent to the gas chamber. So many parallels between the affliction of the Jews in Egypt and the affliction of the Jews during World War II. And then Pharaoh forced the entire nation to start killing the male babies. The midwives, of course, disobeyed. They civilly disobeyed. They obeyed God rather than man, as Peter teaches us in Acts 5:24. And God honored their faith. But look in verse 22. So that didn't work, commanding the midwives to kill the Jewish boys. That didn't work. Verse 22, Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, the Nile River, and every daughter you shall save alive. The Nile River was one of the gods of Egypt. And Pharaoh was thinking, when you cast your son in there, it's like you are offering an offering to our God. And the servants of the God, the crocodiles, the alligators, will accept your offering. And interesting, at the very end of verse 22, in the end of chapter 1, he says, and every daughter you shall save alive. Wow, that backfired. God's provision. You have the birth of a Redeemer in chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. Pharaoh commanded the nation in chapter 1, verse 21 and 22, to spare the daughters. Yet it was the daughters whom God used to defeat Pharaoh's plan. He used those 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives in chapter 1, to save the baby boys. And then Moses' mother, chapter 2, verse 1, and there went a man out of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of the Jews. That's found in chapter 6, verse 20, Jochebed and his wife. And in verse 2, And the woman conceived and had and bare a son. And when she saw that he was a goodly child, she hid him for 3 months. So, like the midwife, she is civilly disobeying. She's obeying God rather than man. Verse 3, and when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark that would be a paper ark, made of paper, but waterproof with this substance that drove away the alligators. And so you have the midwives, you have Moses' mother, you have Moses' sister in verse 2, who also would go and watch the baby boy in the Nile River every day. And then you have Pharaoh's own daughter in chapter 2, verses 5 to 10. She goes down to the Nile River, not with a bar of soap to bathe. She probably had a marble tub in her palace. But when she went down there because the Nile River was thought to help a woman who was unable to have a baby to have a baby. So can you imagine? She's down there in the Nile River with this ritual bathing, and a baby boy is spotted. And when the lid is lifted, Billy Sunday, the evangelist, said God gently pinched that baby so it would start crying and touch that mother's heart. Well, her heart was touched. And she took the baby boy home, who would become the deliverer, who would provide, humanly speaking, the redemption for Israel. What a story. You have the birth of the Redeemer, then you have the training of the Redeemer. So that when the Pharaoh's daughter spotted the child, Moses' sister was there, Miriam, said, I have an idea. Let me get a Hebrew mother to nurse the baby for you. That could have taken 4 to 5 years. The book of Second Maccabees, that one of those intertestamental books that's not inspired, but it does give you some history of those times, said nursing could take place 4 to 5 years. So look at Moses at the knee of his godly mother and his father. Hebrews 11 tells us, verse 23, both of the husband and father, the mother and the dad, trained him. And so all that biblical training was instilled in him until he was old enough to go to the home of Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 10, and the child grew and was brought unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him out of the waters. And we know he was trained in all the wisdom of Egypt, according to what Stephen said in Acts 7:21-22. So he had spiritual training, which set his course that all the secular training of Egypt could not undo. That training in Egypt was called the Harvard of Egypt. It's been called that. Stephen wrote, Moses was trained in all the wisdom of Egypt. Moses was educated in chemistry by the Egyptians who embalmed pharaohs like King Tut. Moses was educated in the Egyptians who painted murals that are 4,000 years old. Moses was trained by the builders of the great pyramids in Giza. So Moses has this incredible training. And what we're going to see in verse 11, and it came to pass. So that jumps 35 years to when Moses is about 40 years old. And we'll see the next stage where God prepares him to overthrow Egypt. So here's an MPS that you could use for this passage. We must let God redeem us from the slavery of sin, interrogative why. So you can use why or how or what. But why fits here. Transitional sentence, because of the following reasons. There's a key word if you use why. And you have because with each main division. Because of the need of redemption, chapter 1. Explain, argue. That's where you bring in biblical references, your theology, to help support that explanation. You have an illustration and then application. And you do the same thing. That should be because of God's provision of redemption in Exodus 2. Same thing. Explanation, argumentation, illustration, application. And in your conclusion, you will repeat the main point of the sermon and the main divisions, and then you will give your final exhortation to practice the main point of the sermon. So we'll continue on next time in our study of Exodus.